One.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening around the world. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it's my privilege today to welcome all of you to join my colleagues and I for the first event in our Rebuilding the Global Economy series. Today, talking about the role of the U.S. Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Representative, with direct advice to the Secretary of Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, and the Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Security. Joining us today will be Evan Greenberg of Chubb, and of course, a member of the Peterson Institute Board of Directors, Chad Bown, the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, and Martin Chorzempa, Research Fellow at the Peterson Institute. I will turn it over to them for the substantive discussion, but first allow me just a moment to explain why we're rebuilding the global economy, or rather why we're doing our best to create a work plan for policymakers to rebuild the global economy. Globalization's been corroding, arguably, since 2008 at least. It's been corroding after years of international openness and commerce going together with increasing economic security for the vast majority of people in the world. And that has turned around. And all of the existential threats that we face, starting, of course, with climate change and the pandemic, but also issues of technological slowdown, racial and gender oppression, digital disinformation, all of these are global problems. These are problems that are being made worse, not better, by retreat into isolationism, made worse, not better, by interstate conflict, made worse, not better, by the contraction of economic opportunity. In the end, these are human problems that have economic aspects, and we need a global economic approach to deal with them, even though every country, including the US and the policymakers we speak to today, have to speak in their own self-interest to do so. So that is why we've launched Rebuilding the Global Economy. Heading into 2021 and a new US presidential term, whoever wins the election, we are going to define the critical priorities and solutions for all of the senior policymakers in the US, in the EU, and in the major international financial and WTO organizations. Clearly, this is not the entire world. Interest groups representing those from the NGO sector, environmental concerns, women and excluded people's concerns, business groups, labor groups, they all should have a seat at the table. We do not presume to speak for them. We presume to put out our best ideas and engage them in speaking with us and the world. Similarly, when we say we're writing for the US officials, for the European officials, for some international organizations, it's not because the other countries of the world, the other regions of the world don't deserve a seat at the table. In fact, they deserve a seat at the table more than they've ever had. But in the end, our officials, our fellows, our board members are coming from the countries they are coming from the backgrounds where they have standing, and we only presume to speak to those officials. But there's also no question that the US, the EU, and key international organizations are the ones who will have to act first and quickly to rebuild the global economy. I chose the term rebuilding as, I think, very apt verb for us, because in the end, we've had a global economy that exists whether or not countries choose to engage in it, whether or not governments choose to be constructive. And the global economy that we've had was jury-rigged every time in the early 70s in 1989 to readjust the architecture a bit from the 40s. But we're now in a world where the environment is much more, literally and figuratively, the environment is much more hostile. We're in a world where there are growing and fully grown countries and peoples that do not have adequate space in the economy. We're in a world where the accessibility of the building is insufficient by our standards of today. But it is reparable. It is able to be repaired. And that is where we are trying to hit the sweet spot by making practical, very clear priority statements to the key policymakers of what should be done and, frankly, what they should stop doing right now. Over the next 3 months, we will be releasing a series of memos, a grand total of 50, it turns out, to the leading policymakers in the world. And by leading policymakers, we don't mean individuals, we mean the offices they hold. Today, we start by looking at the U.S. Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Representative, which are in the critical front line of how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world, how security and competitiveness interact with economic policy and international trade, and how multilateral, plurilateral, unilateral, and just plain conflictual approaches to the global economy play out. We're delighted to have you with us today, and we have 4 excellent speakers to take us through this. Leading off will be Evan Greenberg, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Chubb Limited and Chubb Group. He also has, of course, an incredibly distinguished career building other insurance companies, and then has spent 25 years at the American International Group, where he served as President and Chief Operating Officer from 1997 to 2000. Importantly to us, Evan is an active member of the board of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and one of the leading business person's voices for sober, sound, aggressive in a good way, trade policy by the U.S. He serves on the board of directors. He's also the vice chair of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and a director of the U.S.-China Business Council, and he serves by presidential appointment on the United States Trade Representatives Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. Evan will speak first, followed by Chad Bown. Chad Bown is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, having joined us in April 2016 after service on the Senior Economist for International Trade and Investment in the White House and the Council of Economic Advisors. He co-hosts with Sumaya Kane's Trade Talks, a weekly podcast, which many of you listen to and should. He's also a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he leads our trade efforts brilliantly. He will be followed by Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Institute. Mary is also Professor of Economics and Melvin A. Eggert Faculty Scholar at the Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. In short, she is a very distinguished academic, has spent years including as editor of the China Economic Review, and she combines interests in international economics, trade, and China's development. Final speaker today will be Martin Chorzempa. Martin joined us in, it's 3 years now, and is a rising star. He has working on a book on Chinese fintech and issues of both privacy and economics. He's been an expert on financial innovation, working at the People's Bank in China, working in Germany as a Fulbright scholar with the Association of German Banks. And he was, when we met him, working with CF40, China's leading independent think tank. We're proud to have him with us at America's leading independent think tank now. So now let me turn it over to my friend, Evan Greenberg, please.
Thank you. Much of this discussion will focus today on trade and economic and through the lens of US-China, because that's where we have great preoccupation. Regardless of US-China, broadly speaking, we need to run our own race much better as a country when it comes to economics and business. If we want to maintain a global leadership position and peace and prosperity for our own people. That's what my comments relate to in particular. On the other hand, I am quite mindful, as part of our strategy as a nation, we must defend our own interests. While we are more open and market-oriented than most, the notion that we must defend against are a few. Predatory industrial policy. We must insist upon the notion of reciprocity in exchange for access to our markets, particularly with large nations. And we must defend against competitors who embrace competition by any means when we advocate for a rules-based system. But with that, I want to focus my comments more on running our own race better because frankly, without that, the rest doesn't really matter. First, to be extremely practical, we're in the middle of COVID, and the health response to COVID has been to shut down the economy or substantially impact the economy. We need to develop a strategy around ways to open the economy quickly while we control the virus. The virus is not going away, but while we can control the infection rate of the virus and protect our citizens. I would urge at a federal level, national standards and enforcement of them for COVID-19 testing, digital tracing, masking, and social distancing. We have to establish global surveillance and forensic capabilities and standards and protocols. And we have to do it with Europe and with China to restart travel and restart global trade and economic to a much greater degree. And in spite of the anger, which I understand, and the sensitivity surrounding China's behavior, it is in our interest to get past the politicalization of the issue and agree upon a forward-looking plan. We need to reestablish our leadership in promoting global commerce and confidence in the system that comes from leadership. That means we have to advance and re-embrace multilateral agreements that focus upon Asia and Europe in particular, and digital technology, which is so much of the future of economic development and economic competitiveness. We need rules of engagement around that. That means in asserting that leadership, we should reimagine joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There should be in the longer term, we should reimagine how we remake WTO with partners. If we didn't have WTO today, we would be creating it because there is a need for it. Technology, we should negotiate with our trading partners, rules of engagement for technology and data flows that include data flows, intellectual property protections, technology standards, national security protections, and privacy. When you think about one of the greatest assets of this country, whether it is multilateral agreements or it is coming up with the rules of the road, it is about our system of alliances. Our system of alliances is a force multiplier for this nation. And one of the challenges we face in technology development, and when we face competitors such as China, is China has an advantage of scale, and an advantage of scale that we don't have that's important in technology and the use of data. Imagining agreements that would give us rules of the road around technology and data flows and intellectual property protection means that along with allies and those who share our values, we could gain the advantage of scale that would improve our ability to compete in this area. Reinvigorating American competitiveness and break the practical pattern of tit-for-tat behavior with China. You lead with strength. If we run our own race well, with strength comes confidence, and we act with confidence. And that means strategic patience. And in dealing with China and imagining the issues with China, it begins at the wellhead of strategic patience. We act as a leader. We will promote the kind of system and the kind of vision to the rest of the world that is in keeping with our values and our vision. China will then have a decision in its own interest, either to become a part of that or to be excluded from it, and therefore miss out on the opportunities that a global rules-based system that promotes the right kind of values and what we stand for, that's the world that they would want to join because it would promote their interests. If not, then they will go another way. their decision to make. Improving labor and capabilities through immigration and skills enhancement. We need to improve productivity. We need to grow the economy faster. And we need to advance our capabilities more quickly in the areas of the economy that hold the greatest promise for the future. And so much of that is about skills and skills-based training and immigration, both together. Insisting that everybody go to college and that college is the answer to an individual's own future and prosperity, I think is misguided. We should be encouraging and at a national scale, not in small projects, skills-based training that meets the needs of so many jobs that are open today that we cannot fill, that are well-paying. Before the crisis, there were over 10 million jobs in this country that were open because we could not find the right skills. We already have the infrastructure in place as a nation. It's the community college system. And we should be encouraging greater technology, greater skills-based training around those technologies, and that meet the needs of businesses that are in the areas of those community colleges. At the same time, that won't be enough. We need immigration at scale when the pandemic crisis has passed that would allow us to import much more talent that would enhance our ability in those skills. And by the way, together, the growth of that population will enhance the growth of our economy. And faster economic growth is what we need if we want to spend the money that government needs to spend to enhance business capability and economics in this country. Investing in digital and physical infrastructure, rails, ports, 5G digital communication, that's a force multiplier for competitive growth. Those are the areas that the government should be investing in. Deficit spending in areas like that, that's a force multiplier. That's an investment in future economic growth and competitiveness in this country. And that's the kind I certainly would encourage we embrace. North America and North America competitiveness. When I imagine the competitive profile of our country, I can think of, in the top list of priorities, I can think of nothing more important than deeper integration of North America. It's Canada and the United States culturally and by rule of law and the direction we're going in, we will continue to deepen our integration. The question is really one around Mexico. Supply chains are reorganizing in the world. They will over a number of years to come. There has been zero FDI investment into Mexico for the past 2 years. There has been very little domestic investment in Mexico for the past 2 years. We should be asking ourselves why. We've signed a USMCA agreement and we are complementary with Mexico in terms of the capabilities we bring and the capabilities that Mexico brings, and more supply chain and more business ought to be moving there. And the consumer market and the middle class ought to be growing in Mexico. There is a problem. The current economic direction of the country, security, sanctity of contract, efficiency and capability within the bureaucracy are all issues we should be addressing. The political direction of the country is in the wrong direction. And I would encourage that we focus on this with a whole of government strategy. It is only America that can provide influence and help Mexico to move in a direction that will encourage deeper North American integration. Promote innovation through government and private sector partnerships. We need more investment in R&D and in the basic sciences and technologies that can then be applied to application that grows the economy. We're at a low point in that kind of investment. Industrial policy is not a bad word, and yet in our lexicon, we don't embrace that term. Industrial policy that picks winners and losers is the wrong direction in my judgment. The government should never pick winners and losers, but an industrial policy that supports the development of the basic sciences and technologies that will fuel the development of our economy is an enlightened view of industrial policy. And I would encourage that. Finally, encouraging business to decarbonize and to mitigate climate change. Climate change is an existential threat globally. And on the other hand, it is a great economic opportunity for our country. We must increase the cost of carbon and the usage of carbon. Carbon tax, carbon cap and trade, those should all be on the table and things that we consider. And then the encouragement of a movement towards more natural gas while we move towards greener technologies in the future is a practical way to move. Energy, utilities, and transportation, and investing in more efficient transmission capabilities. We should have a very focused agenda around that in a practical, not an ideological way, that balances economic needs and costs and what's practically achievable, while at the same time we encourage more aspirational green movement in the future. With that, I'll turn it back over to Adam.
Thank you, Evan. As you all know, the tradition has been to appoint leading business people to the position of Secretary of Commerce. Our MP Peterson served in that capacity. I think Evan has no interest in serving in that capacity, but he is the kind of person, and this is the kind of vision we would want in that capacity, and that's why we asked him to do this. Thank you very much for contributing your thoughts. Let me move now to Chad Bown, who is speaking about the role of the U.S. Trade Representative and what should be done in that job. Another person who is eminently qualified to talk. Chad.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Evan, as well, for the opportunity to be here. So I'm going to only try to take 5 minutes or so. I wrote a memo, so I'd invite everybody to look at the memo for the details that I won't get to. It's only 2 pages. Well, it's a bit longer than 2 pages because it's got some great charts. As you know, I love charts. So what I wanted to focus on today is maybe 4 or 5 action items. Be very precise about things that the U.S. Trade Representative needs to do starting in 2021. And obviously underpinning a lot of this is China, right? Long run concerns with China. But to start, that's not where I'm going to lead. So, and it'll make sense why in a moment. So the first thing we absolutely need to do is to reset our economic relationships with allies. And so if you think about it, our allies are still retaliating against us. The European Union is still retaliating against us with higher tariffs on American exporters. And what that means is we need to get rid of those national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. Now, that won't be all, because anytime you make a change in trade policy, there is going to be some adjustment that takes place. And so there may be complementary domestic policies that we need to do to help offset some of the changes that are gonna result in those industries because of changes in trade policies. But we need to get the retaliation against Americans removed, and the only way that we can do that is by following the rules and getting rid of these national security tariffs. At the same time, we're going to need to engage, a global process to deal with the problems out there in those industries of excess capacity, if that's the case, but certainly the subsidies that show up. There needs to be a global set of negotiations, targeted negotiations to deal with these underlying problems, and there really hasn't been over the last 4 years, despite opportunities to do so. And then, if there is unfair trade that's happening in those sectors, there are other tools that can be utilized. Obviously, there's the unfair trade laws in the United States and other countries. But if it just becomes so important for the United States to protect its steel industry or aluminum industry for political reasons, there are legal ways with trading partners that you can do this. The one technical thing I'll say is Article 28. We can negotiate for ourselves with trading partners higher tariffs if we have to have them. We'll have to give them something in return, but we've effectively ended up there over the last couple of years with retaliation anyway. There's a rules-based way to do what it is that needs to be done. The second thing, and this is where I'll start with starting to think about China a little bit, we need to get rid of the artificial targets in the Phase 1 agreement with China. These targets that China would magically start buying an additional $200 billion of American goods and services over the next 2 years. When you look at the data, the numbers, obviously, it's just not happening. But even if it were happening, I think it would be happening for the wrong reasons. Reasons that are antithetical to what the United States' broader overall goals are. The current Phase 1 agreement with China still has all of the tariffs in place, or most all of the tariffs in place that China imposed over the course of the trade war. And so what that means is if China's actually buying lots and lots more American stuff, it's not the private sector in China that's doing so. There's no incentives for the Chinese private sector, which can buy from European or Brazilian or Japanese suppliers without paying these extra retaliatory tariffs to do so. So if the purchases are happening, they're going to be happening through China's state-owned enterprises, which are inconsistent with the Americans' broader goals of trying to limit some of the adverse consequences of non-market activity, subsidies, state-owned enterprises. The second argument there is these purchases, if they were going to happen, were largely going to come at the expense of allies. And it's impossible for the Americans to convince our key trading partners, the Europeans, the Japanese, that we're serious working together on issues of common concern when we're telling China all we want you to do is to buy from us and not them. And that's what a purchase commitment type of approach ends up doing for you. So we need to get rid of those and focus on the real goals that we have with China, where again, I am very much in line with the points that Evan made, which is focusing on ourselves, worrying about our own competitiveness. Third point, re-engage and refocus the World Trade Organization. Absolutely critical. 95% of the world lives outside of American borders. That means lots and lots of consumers, but it's also where a lot of the other economic activity in the world takes place, other companies. And we want them to be following rules, the rule of law in dealing with sort of market-based conditions. We don't have free trade agreements with most of those people in most of those countries. We want them to be playing by fair rules. The WTO has traditionally done that. There's nothing really wrong with the WTO's existing rules. Where things are wrong, it's essentially that they're incomplete. More needs to be done, certainly. But there's nothing really fundamentally incorrect about the basics, the foundational elements of the WTO. So it needs to be built upon. We need to negotiate first and foremost a new system of dispute settlement to replace the appellate body. You need to have a way that these rules can be enforced to help get rid of the uncertainty out there in the trading system. And then we'll need to turn to negotiate with probably just a limited set of critical countries, the new rules, probably plurilaterally, on the most critical issues. And that includes subsidies, whether they're industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, how to deal with these different economic systems, but also farm subsidies, and to deal with climate, fossil fuel subsidies, fishery subsidies. I think these are critical and they have to be dealt with. The last point that I'll make, and this again will tie in with what Evan was mentioning, is the U.S. Trade Representative has a role in helping Americans get domestic policy right. There are going to be calls to do industrial policy, to reshore some of these, or to change some of the global supply chains for medical devices or equipment. We need to create policies in America that the rest of the world wants to emulate, so that when they impose those policies, we're happy with their policies and we don't feel as though they discriminated against our companies and our workers. So that means we need to set up the right policies ourselves in the first place. We want other countries to emulate our policies, not to litigate against our policies or retaliate against our policies. And there, the U.S. Trade Representative's office has a huge role to play in helping domestic policymakers in the United States get our house in order. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Chad. And Chad rightly pointed out that all four of our speakers today and all of the speakers in our series have very brief, very pointed, very clear memos that we have posted on the PIIE website and which are available for distribution, publication, republication, and preferably people reading and thinking about them. You can start with Chad's and Evan's, which are up there right now. Let me turn to my colleague, Mary Lovely, who is about to provide advice to the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. Mary.
Thank you, Adam. And it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. This is exciting to think about what we can do in the years ahead to meet some of the challenges that we face today. So I am providing advice to the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. And it's clear that international trade contributes to American prosperity, resilience, social inclusion, and sustainability. The Undersecretary of Commerce has the tools to shape policies that harness the power of international exchange and cooperation for these purposes. The Undersecretary should say it clearly and loudly: trade contributes to our prosperity. Exports allow our most productive companies and farms to expand. These companies in turn drive opportunities for local producers. Given the policies of the last 4 years, the Undersecretary has two immediate and impactful ways to promote a healthier U.S. economy. First, the Undersecretary has the unique opportunity to reclaim our place in the Pacific region by promoting U.S. entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Regional agreements lower trade barriers for members to the disadvantage of those on the outside. The U.S. should be on the inside, not the outside of this high-quality agreement, which creates high labor standards, environmental standards, and data standards throughout the region while opening markets for American producers. Similarly, the U.S. should seek to strengthen U.S. partnership with Mexico, as Evan spoke about. A North American supply network, a competitive, robust North American supply network will help to drive U.S. competitiveness. Secondly, the Undersecretary should champion an end to the tariffs implemented since 2017. These have halted U.S. manufacturing job growth and placed U.S. firms at the mercy of government payouts. We have ample evidence from the last 3 years to know that protection preserves a few jobs in favored sectors, but kills far more by raising the cost of production for everyone else. We have seen that tariffs imposed unilaterally and outside internationally accepted norms lead to retaliation by other countries, the loss of export markets, and more job loss here at home. The appropriate action is simple: remove tariffs that serve no further purpose. In the particular case of China, the Undersecretary should work with USTR to clarify the objectives of U.S. policy and assess the prospects for Chinese market opening in exchange for these removal of these tariffs. Secondly, the ongoing pandemic illustrates the need for trade to contribute to American resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from adversity. Resilience cannot come from producing everything domestically that we might possibly need in a crisis, but rather from a considered mix of preparedness, perhaps it's through stockpiling, and the creation of a diversified and trusted international partnership. In the provision of medical supplies and medicines, COVID-19 has taught us a few hard lessons. First, information is power. Getting adequate supplies where they are most needed requires timely and accurate information on stocks and supplies. As my PIIE colleague, Chad Bown, has noted, an international market information system exists for food stocks and may have helped to prevent export controls on food supplies. But such a system does not exist for medical supplies and medicines. The Undersecretary can work with foreign partners to create and maintain such an information market system for medical supplies and medicines. Secondly, trade provides resilience only if borders remain open during a time of crisis. Rather than being openly dependent on one supplier, new analysis by Simon Evenet shows that remarkably few nations have concentrated sourcing patterns for medical supplies. This diversification is a source of strength. It mitigates risk, as rarely are all suppliers similarly affected by a disaster at the same time, if the U.S. can count on access to those supplies when it needs it. The Undersecretary should promote a plurilateral agreement with trusted trade partners that ensures mutual aid and maintenance of open borders in times of crisis for medical supply and medicine trade. Thirdly, trade can promote social inclusion. Changes in the global economy cause disruption and dislocation in the United States and often are seen as a strain on the American social fabric. Yet it is impossible to fully insulate American workers from these changes while ensuring a vital and growing economy. While labor, tax, and education policies seek to improve conditions for American workers, trade policy can also play a useful role. First, the Undersecretary must enforce laws protecting U.S. workers from unfair trade. But we must go further. Only by working with our allies, notably the European Union and Japan, can we take the problems caused by predatory state subsidies, exporting of overcapacity, and intellectual property theft and actually make a difference. Secondly, the Undersecretary should work with the administration to extend export opportunities to more workers in more regions. The pandemic offers ample evidence that economic activity can flourish outside of American cities and coasts. By promoting robust rural broadband expansion and 5G provision, and actively seeking opportunities for services exports from remote locations, the Undersecretary can open new opportunities for U.S. service exports. Lastly, trade must contribute to sustainable growth. Already, American companies are producing new products and services for a low carbon future. The Undersecretary must help ensure that these companies are able to enter foreign markets by articulating the risks of a broad Buy American provisions, which invite other countries to lock U.S. products out of government procurements abroad. He or she should also raise awareness of the costs of failing to enact policies to mitigate climate change, which will lead directly to adoption of border taxes by our major trading partners and lock out American exports. The Undersecretary also has tools to convene American logistics experts to identify the most promising avenues for reducing the carbon footprint of international trade, including new transport modes, streamlined border procedures, and improved labeling. The Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade should be an important voice within the next administration, promoting policies that harness international exchange for the benefit of all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And once again, spot on in the sweet spot of forthright and practical. All of our work plans are meant to hit that spot, even on the difficult issues. And in that spirit, I turn to Martin Chorzempa, who is writing to the Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Security, which is an increasingly contentious issue and one where the economic and security trade-offs must be navigated. Martin, over to you, please.
Thank you, Adam. It's a real privilege to round out such a set of insightful presentations today. I'm going to talk about export controls, which are some of the most powerful tools available for economic statecraft for the United States today. The goal is to keep U.S. technology and products out of the hands of those who would use it to undermine U.S. economic and security interests. The Commerce Department focuses on the dual use area, which is where we have technologies and goods that have both civilian and military applications. And as civilian technology becomes better and better, a large swath of today's civilian technology, like semiconductors and encryption, can also be used in the defense area, and that's created quite a challenge. I'm going to focus on China, which is the greatest challenge for export controls today, and also perhaps the area where there's the greatest risk of overuse of export controls that backfires and ends up hurting U.S. national security. So I'll begin by talking about the way that the world is changing in ways that are very uncomfortable for the United States and actually erodes the effectiveness of traditional ways of doing export controls. This is not something that we can reverse. So if we go back to the 1960s, the United States was nearly 70% of global research and development, and the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, was one of the dominant forces shaping technology through its both research efforts and being a market for technology companies. If we fast forward to today, the United States has less than 30% of R&D, and the Department of Defense is relatively small in the global technology market. So we just don't have the kind of control over technology in the United States that it used to. And then looking at the share of that R&D outside the United States, there's another trend which is difficult for the US. which is that almost half of that R&D today outside the United States is done in countries that are not traditional security allies of the United States. That means if you impose controls amongst a group of allies, you're still going to miss a lot of the technology, and it's going to be harder to deny technology or goods to places that you might want to. The days of COCOM, this extremely powerful Cold War era multilateral export control regime, are over, and its successor, the Wassenaar Arrangement, is not nearly as powerful, partially because there's less of a consensus now about who is a security threat, as there was when the Soviet Union had tanks on the borders of Europe. And so the result is that U.S. can't veto exports in the way under the Wassenaar Arrangement in the way they could under COCOM. So what does this all mean for export controls? I'm going to go through 4 priorities. The first is simply adjusting to this new reality. The worst case scenario for export controls is that you impose a control so that U.S. firms cannot sell or have a large compliance burden to sell to a given entity or country, but the targeted party can just go on the open market and buy that same good from another source. That is a lose-lose scenario where the U.S. gains nothing in national security, but it loses the revenue for U.S. firms that could have been employed in research and development that would have raised their competitiveness. So you've deprived U.S. firms of an export market without any actual security benefit. In the new world, where you have quite attractive centers for R&D all around the world, and you also have globalized supply chains, this means that unilateral controls imposed from the United States are more and more likely to backfire. So this leads to the first recommendation, which is that a great many technology and products should simply get dropped from controls as they become widely available. There's no real security benefit to it, and it just leads to large compliance costs and loss of market. Another side effect of too many controls and the way that we have too many today is that U.S. firms can easily shift their R&D and production to offshore, and if that means if we pose too many controls, that leads to a de-Americanization of supply chains, the opposite of what's good for the United States. Priority number 2 is using a small yard and a high fence as a guiding principle. This is a phrase borrowed from the former Secretary of Defense Gates, one of the great thinkers on national security. And the idea is that we want to find as narrow possible list of truly critical technologies and then really invest our limited resource in protecting those rather than trying to protect everything, which necessitates, with limited resources, a lower fence, which makes it harder to actually protect those. That means we need to do a careful study of what's truly critical and devote the resources there. A side benefit of more narrow controls is that more countries are likely to go along with us and make those controls multilateral, which means there's a real potential for effective denial or restriction than if the controls are much more broad. And the Commerce Department should continue the Obama-era initiative on export control reform, which loosened controls on some commodity products and products that are not on the cutting edge to focus on the really important technologies we need to protect. Priority number 3 is building situation-specific coalitions where the Wassenaar Arrangement, as it exists today, cannot go far enough, and unilateral controls would backfire. A few shifts have created an interesting set of new opportunities in this area. The first is that the salience of security issues and China has risen significantly all around the world in the wake of the COVID pandemic. We've seen that many more countries in Europe, for example, are restricting Chinese entities' involvement in 5G in a way that many would not have predicted a year ago. And in Europe specifically, there's an initiative to adopt autonomous controls on cyber and surveillance technologies that are not dependent on the Wassenaar Arrangement. And these could align with some of the US controls and entity listings on Xinjiang and make them more multilateral. Another example would be a coalition of the willing on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, to make sure not to take this too far. But all it would need is a few countries to get together with their common interest in concern about intellectual property theft and import substituting industrial policy in China, not necessarily to deny technology, but to kind of pool leverage and and monitor carefully Chinese capabilities in this area and pool leverage to incentivize changes in behavior that one country alone could not, and stop a dividing and conquer strategy. A final priority is incentivizing Chinese reliance, continued reliance and interdependence with the United States on technology, not a decoupling that ends up biting the United States in the long run. The huge expansion in the use of the entity list over the past years has damaged the US reputation as a technology supplier in China. No company in China really knows if it's next, even if it's not supplying to the military or operating in Xinjiang. A lot of the deal makers are now sharing privately that anytime they're trying to sell to China, the Chinese firms are requiring them to certify that they are exempt from export control rules by producing outside of the United States and limiting US content. That leads to de-Americanization. It's not beneficial for US security. Licensing exports is one of the best ways to get a sense of what the capabilities in technology in China are. And if there's a sense that all of the license applications are going to get rejected, then there's no reason to apply and we lose a source of vital intelligence. Unlike earlier uses of the entity list, for example, with Huawei and CTE, the new additions have complaints that are more generally about Chinese policy rather than being clear about a specific action that the Chinese company has taken, which got them on the entity list, and what actions they could take that would get them taken off. That means it's not a recipe, the way it's used now, not a recipe for a change in behavior. Although it is, quote, doing something, the impact on these companies is often symbolic, but has created a real negative perception about the US reliability. This has made it harder for voices in China to argue against even more spending and efforts for self-sufficiency and replacing imports, and has probably accelerated China's drive for self-reliance. Of course, there was already a sense of the Made in China 2025 trying to become self-sufficient, but the question is of degree, and I think it's clear that the actions the US has taken has accelerated China's attempt to decouple from the United States in a way that is probably not beneficial for US security interests. The key question we have to answer now is how much damage has already been done and what can be repaired. So to conclude, export controls are critical, but they're only one piece in a sensible China strategy that preserves the benefits of trade and collaboration in technology while protecting US intellectual property and national security. They need to fit in a set of clear objectives with respect to China to calibrate the right balance, recognizing that exports to large growing markets are generally good for US competitiveness and national security, and usually too much is made of a trade-off between openness and exports that really is not there. It's much more complementary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. In the interest of time to get in as many questions as possible, I encourage everyone to use the chat function. I realize some people are raising their hands, but unfortunately, we can't do that and make sure that people are getting on and off and going through the mute, unmute thing. So please type your question into the chat function and I will convey them to the speakers. The first question would be from Pascal Siegel. With regard to allies, should a Biden administration, I will insert if elected, start by lifting tariffs imposed on allied products? And is it likely they will do so? Let me turn to Evan and Chad for that.
I can't speculate for a Biden administration, but in my judgment, I think that would be the right approach. In the first instance, if the policy of the Biden administration is to reassert and support the importance of our system of alliances that we've built over the last 70 years, then they will take good faith steps to stop sticking their finger in the eye of allies. That's a good way to begin approaching that. And they will remove tariffs. After all, there is little benefit that comes from them. And an overuse of tariffs becomes a weapon of diminishing and a tool of diminishing benefit. On the other hand, I do understand that many treaty agreements that we put in place that exist today with allies have outlived some of their usefulness. They were put in place at a time when the world was a different place, and they need to be modernized and they need to be upgraded, and our allies need to be incented. But you respect your allies. And so I think, you know, all of that considered, a Biden administration would likely lift tariffs if, again, system of alliances becomes an important centerpiece of their strategy.
Thank you, Evan. I made a slip of the tongue. I encourage people to put their questions in the chat function. What they really should do is put their questions in the question and answer function. That's what I'm reading from. My apologies to people who messed that up. Question for Chad from Samuel DuPont. You call for a new dispute settlement mechanism to replace the appellate body rather than just appointing new judges to the AB to get it running again. How should a new dispute settlement system differ from the appellate body? Chad?
That'll be my follow-up memo. So this is, it's the right question. It's going to be complicated. It actually needs to be negotiated with some other things. Politically, the United States, for challenging reasons, has difficulty with, you know, a number of the judgments that have happened over its trade remedy laws. And so there needs to be a new system of enforcement that accommodates that. That may not be something the United States can get for free. We may be having to give up something somewhere else, since that seems to be so important for us. But I think over the long run, to have a dispute settlement function that works, it's going to need to be a little bit more accommodative to our use of certain policy tools that legal rulings have had trouble with over the last couple of years. So it's going to involve trade-offs. It's not as simple as just appointing new judges, but there needs to be some bigger systemic issues that have to be addressed.
Thank you, Chad. I'm going to open this up for the panel. We've got two questions relating to how government works in the U.S., or rather, very insider questions. Naomi Friedman writes, one thing that has been an ongoing problem with the Trump administration is agency heads not staying in their lanes, not having the Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, Ag Secretary, and USTR jockeying for policy leadership. Any ideas on preventing this besides having a White House that provides clear guidance? Relatedly, we have a question from Kelly Myman, excuse me. Given the China tech discussion is now more in the realm of national security than economic policy, in her view, how can our interagency process better reflect this reality? How can we do a better job making sure we're leveraging U.S. tech capabilities? So these are very Washington questions, but they're very relevant questions. And if anybody has any thoughts beyond saying the president should not let this happen, which of course is the first thing, I would welcome them. Chad.
So I think that you're right, they tie together. So I think what needs to happen is a reinvigoration of the interagency process, you know, within the U.S. government. And so what that means is things largely get discussed, worked out, studied, the different equities, the different positions of Treasury, State Department, Commerce Department, EPA, Labor, all get hashed out behind the scenes, not at the top, but by the experts that are the staff level folks at these agencies that have, you know, decades of experience, lots of data at their fingertips, and work through some of the most difficult issues to provide a coherent U.S. government approach to sorts of policies. That's traditionally how things have worked in the United States, not always without hiccups, but it provides an approach that I think is much more coherent than we've been able to see over the last couple of years, where it seems like the interagency process is broken down.
Thank you, Chad. A question for Mary Lovely, please. Sorry, I'm trying to find the right one because I'm trying to read people's thoughts. Well, someone was asking, oh, here we are. John Diggles has asked, how would you assess long-term damage to U.S. agricultural markets from the trade war? How likely is it that American farmers will be in a price war to recover their markets? And again, to the Undersecretary for Trade, how should you deal with the tariffs plus bailouts approach that the Trump administration had put into, as you mentioned, so little good effect?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Obviously, Obviously, the trade war has done perhaps permanent damage to the markets that American farmers spent 20 years cultivating in China. So I think that one thing is clear is that supports have to be removed gradually. And this clearly is related to the function of the undersecretary in terms of advocating for a removal of the China tariffs to the extent possible. And hopefully in exchange for removal of Chinese restrictions on US ag products. We need to return to market-based exchange, a system that was serving the US extremely well prior to the US-China trade war. And as Chad said, move away from the top-down state-dominated buying system, which is encouraged by the Phase 1 deal. So I think we can move away. We have to be sure that we pay attention to how quickly farmers are able to recover their markets, but those markets are still there. We just need to become a trusted supplier again.
And Naomi Freeman points out, of course, that ag exports are covered by ag, not Department of Ag, not ITA, going back to the agencies issue. But thank you for your response, Mary, because it is the kind of response we need. A question for Martin, then a question for Evan. Martin, Jacob Kopnick writes, at what point does looking to continue Chinese reliance on the US and deepening ties with China go too far? Do we just draw the line at forced labor, which, as you know, internally, when we were discussing your memo, was one of our questions as well?
Yes, so it's an excellent question. I think ultimately it comes down to the overall strategy and vision of the relationship with China. The way I consider it is something like a sonic equalizer, the old stereo systems where you raise and lower different elements of the sound to get the right balance based on, there are going to be areas where, frankly, we do decouple from China in a limited sense, where we say, the security implications of, say, working on facial recognition technology when we see how that's used with China's security services, maybe that's an area where we have to reduce some of the previous engagement. But in others, there are plenty of ways that we could increase it, for example, in collaboration on climate change. So I would say it's going to be more of a careful calibration, a more nuanced approach, and I hope that the next administration would do that. Obviously, forced labor is a hard line where you don't want to engage with that.
Let me close. We're getting near the end, so let me pose to Evan two last questions, if I may. One from Gene Whalen. You advocated pushing China to comply with a rules-based trading system. What specifically should the U.S. do if China doesn't comply? Advocate its removal from the WTO? ? And the second question, because you and Chad and everyone rightly emphasized that a lot of this is not just about China, and even when it's China, it's about domestic U.S. policy. Irving Williamson writes, while all of the excellent policies you propose will benefit all Americans, don't we also need to address questions of racial injustice and income inequality in the U.S.? How would you link the policies you advocate today to that issue, both for its own sake and for political support? Those are two very big questions, but I think they relate to the themes that you and everyone's been talking about.
Yeah, and thank you for those questions. First on the one of China and the rules and a rules-based system. First of all, no, I would not remove China from the WTO. I think that's counterproductive. China should be a part of the rules-based trading system. It's a question of, to me, whose vision of the world do we want to promote? And I advocate for promoting with strength America's vision of a world based around a rules-based, market-oriented trading system that embraces the notions of comparative advantage. And you do that in a multilateral way. And those who want to become and adhere to those rules, both within their own domestic market and when they participate outside their market, and not pick and choose among the rules when they serve your own individual interest, well, those are who naturally, those are the countries that will be both participants, keepers of the rules and who will be both beneficiaries, and you also pay a price for those rules. It'll be, returning to something, as my friend Bob Zolik said a number of years ago, we all are responsible stakeholders. And so China would have a chance. It's their own decision to make, not our decision to make for them. And you either, in your own national interest, and you either want to be part of it or you don't. The second question around inclusion and to me, racial justice. I think the notion of skills-based training and giving a path to those who do not participate and don't have the opportunity to participate fully in our economy today is an important issue. We need to better democratize capitalism and a market-oriented system, frankly, if we want to preserve it. If it only benefits a few, and it only benefits elitists, and only benefits white people, well, then we have a real problem in this country that will not go away. And encouraging everyone to go to college, I don't think actually is by itself the way we're going to create better upward mobility and prosperity, particularly among Black colleagues and citizens within our country. And I think skills-based training and the opportunities those provide for those who have a basic high school education, because frankly, there is so much available in that way, is both practical and frankly, we don't have to wait a decade to see the benefits of it. We could do it now. So thank you for that question.
And thank you for that reply. This has been a fabulous start to the Rebuilding the Global Economy project at the Peterson Institute. I encourage everyone to share the videos, the memos, the subscription to keep track of what we're doing, but take on its own terms, stand alone. This was a great session with very practical, real-world advice to the benefit of all for what the Commerce Department and what the U.S. Trade Representative should be doing. My apologies to the many on the Q&A whose questions I could not work in, and to those of you who raised hands but we couldn't get your questions in the type box. We look forward to continuing the dialogue online and in other venues, and all four of our speakers I know are ready to engage in other venues and other times on these topics. Let me thank in particular Martin Chorzempa, Mary Lovely, Chad Bown, and Evan Greenberg for their fantastic presentations.